Supply is going to look very similar to demand. We have a lot of the same factors that actually shift both of these, and then we'll look at them together and look at how those affect price and quantity. So supply is an upward shift. Supply is an upward sloping curve, right? So demand was downward sloping. Supply is upward sloping. So I'll draw that in pink, right? So price and quantity. Supply is our upward sloping curve. If we're talking about increases in supply, we're talking about rightward movements. Again, the same truth holds when we're talking about price changes. Those are movements, right? Price changes just move us along the curve, right? Firms are willing to supply more whenever they can sell the good for more. Shifts in supply mean that at a given price, right, if I hold the price constant, there's going to be an increase in supply. Okay, so again, movements versus shifts. Movements are always dealing with price changes. Shifts are dealing with a number of other factors. So I won't list them out. I'm going to save this space for drawing some graphs, but we'll talk about things that shift the supply curve. One great example is the number of suppliers. Let's talk about the craft beer industry. That's always one of my favorites. There's been an increase in the number of brewers that have started brewing craft beer. So at a given price per bottle or per keg, right, there's more supply of the item. So number of suppliers is a good one. Again, preferences, maybe natural disasters will affect supply. If there's a drought, which we'll talk about in a sec as one of my examples, that could decrease supply. It could also be the case that the cost of my inputs have been increasing. So if it's more expensive for me to produce an item, I want to reduce my production. That one usually trips students up, but if you think about this, if your prices are really low, right, you don't want to sell as much. Right? When prices are really high, you want to sell. Remember, this is what you're willing and able to sell on. That's really important. So we're talking about shifts in this curve. Again, so check the book and check the online lecture notes. You'll see a bunch of different ones. The key thing, just like demand, movements just move along the supply curve. Movements in price just move along the demand curve. So let's draw a couple graphs, right? So I'm just going to quickly label a bunch of these, and we're going to look at what happens to price and quantity when things change. Right, so again, get used to being comfortable drawing price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis. So we have demand and supply, demand and supply, demand and supply, demand and supply. Right, these all look the same. It's upward sloping supply curves, downward sloping demand curves. Let's look at these one by one and figure out what happens to price. So in each of these, I'll draw us a little price and quantity. These are our equilibrium points to start. And then we'll look at what happens to equilibrium when we change those. And then right here, I'm going to save a good one. What happens when two shifts occur at the same time? So let's start with, we'll do demand shifts at the top. What happens when demand increases? Right, so an increase in demand is a rightward shift of the demand curve. And whenever demand increases, it's kind of what you expect to happen. Whenever there's an increase in demand, say maybe from population, our prices go up, our quantity goes up as well. Ooh, I forgot that. Right, so demand means that prices go up, quantity goes up. What happens when demand decreases? Right? Decreases in demand are a leftward shift. You'll notice a new equilibrium point. We have a decrease in quantity and a decrease in price. Right, so demand shifts by themselves, relatively easy. Let's look at supply shifts. Right, so on this one, we'll talk about an increase in supply. Again, right shifts. Keep that in the back of your mind. Right and left, not up and down. Right, so when supply shifts, I produce more, and the price is lowered. Right, as there's more suppliers in the market, more people are going to produce items. The price is going to fall because there's extra supply. We need to sell those goods. When supply decreases, leftward shift. We have new prices where prices has gone up and quantity has gone down. Right, so if you think about supply shifts, think of droughts. The most recent drought in California. that has decreased supply tremendously. What we see is higher prices and fewer quantities of goods being sold. Individual shifts by themselves, relatively easy to work on. This becomes a repetition type problem. The more you draw these supply and demand curves, the better you'll get at them. Right? So I've been doing this for about a decade. After a while, you get used to drawing these curves. What happens though when two things happen simultaneously? Right? So over the past 10 years, we've seen a large population increase. Right? So that's an increase in demand. Right? But at the same time, we've seen technology improve. Right? And so that's an increase in supply. Firms have been willing and able to supply it more output because technology's improved. So let's look at these two things on a graph simultaneously. If you started graphing this without kind of thinking it through, you would say supply, demand increases, supply increases, and then you'd say, uh-oh, there's too many lines crossing. Right? And there's a lot going on. We started here, right? And then I said demand, supply increases, demand increases, right? We have multiple points, and that is all of a sudden, when two things happen at the same time, we have to kind of go, whoa, this is too much going on at once. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to erase this, because this is a terrible way to do dual shifts. All right, so I wanted to graph that to show you that shifting two curves at the same time is not a good idea. I don't recommend that. What I recommend is you can do them individually. Fantastic. Let's look at them individually and figure out what happens. What happens whenever there's an increase in demand? Right, so I'm going to draw an increase in demand. Let's just hop over to our graph over here. We already did an increase in demand. We said that price goes up and quantity goes up. Right? So quantity increased, price increased. That's okay. We're comfortable with that. That's what we expect to happen whenever the population increases. When supply increases, we also did that here. Supply increases. We said that price goes down, quantity goes up. So the best way to tackle these dual movement problems is to think of them individually. When both shifts happen at the same time, it's very hard to figure out what is going to happen because it depends on how you draw your graphs. What we know for sure is that whenever demand increases, quantity increases. We also know that when supply increases, quantity increases. When these dual shifts happen at the same time, we are very confident and we're certain that quantity is going to go up, because in demand it goes up, in supply it goes up. The problem rests in the price. Price could go up or price could go down. We consider this, and we call it that the price is ambiguous. We don't know what's going to happen. It depends on the relative size of the supply and the demand shift. If the price goes down, that means that the supply curve dominated. There was a really large supply shift. If the price went up, then we say that the demand curve dominated. The demand shift was very strong, and it overwhelmed the decrease that we saw in price. So the best way to handle dual movements, break them down into individual movements, and then determine what's common between the two. Right? So both quantity increased in this case. Price change is ambiguous. It could be the case that the supply shift was so large that the price overall went down, or it could be the case the demand shift was so large that the price went up. So whenever you're dealing with supply and demand shifts, break them down individually. Be comfortable with the individual methods. If you're asked a question about dual shifts, break them into two parts and evaluate them individually. Figure out what they have in common, and then the other part is ambiguous. And just know that if we can see a supply shift or a demand shift, then we know which one's larger. On the next video, we'll be talking about consumer and producer surplus, both with price controls and without price controls.